Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive, frankly fascinating puzzle: how grassroots governance in India actually works on the ground. We're talking about the folks responsible for the stuff right outside your front door: your local roads, the water supply, the neighborhood schools. We'll look at the grand constitutional promise of empowering citizens at the village and municipality level, and then we're going to compare that to the much harsher, much messier reality of what really happens out there. Let's get into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the clear path we're taking today. 1. The vision of decentralization. 2. Mapping the three-tier system. 3. The PESA Act exception. 4. Bureaucracy and funding shortfalls. And finally, number 5, unchecked corruption and potential solutions. All right, Section 1, the vision of decentralization. You see, the folks sitting in the central or state capitals literally cannot fix every single village pothole, monitor every local school, or unclog every town's drainage system. It's just not possible. So the push for true local democracy evolved over an entire century. It actually kicked off way back in 1882 with Lord Ripon. Then it got a nudge from the Government of India Acts in the early 1900s. Post-independence, the 1952 Community Development Program tried setting up a three-tier system. But the real game changer? That was 1992. The passing of the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments finally gave official, rock-solid constitutional recognition to these local bodies. Now, before we get into the really messy reality of how this operates today, we need to quickly lock down 3 major keywords: the Gram Sabha, the State Election Commission, and the State Finance Commission. Knowing exactly what these definitions are is absolutely crucial to grasping the rest of this explainer. First up, the Gram Sabha. By definition, this is a body consisting of all adult members registered as voters in a village panchayat area. So think of it as the fundamental, direct democratic unit at the village level. It's not just a handful of elected reps, right? It is literally the people of the village themselves. Next, we have the State Election Commission, or SEC. This is defined as a state-appointed independent officer responsible for conducting local body elections for both panchayats and municipalities. The key takeaway here is that local elections are handled by the specific state-level body, not the National Election Commission of India. Keep that tucked away in your mind because it creates some massive structural headaches later on. And our third key term is the State Finance Commission, or the SFC. By definition, this is a state-appointed body that reviews the distribution of revenues between the state and local governments. Basically, they control the money hose. And you know what's wild? States are often so reluctant to share their funds that the 15th Central Finance Commission actually had to threaten to withhold state grants just to force states to set up these SFCs. And hey, this isn't a partisan thing. This hesitation spans across all sorts of state governments. Let's move on and see how this builds in Section 2, mapping the three-tier system. Let's look at the actual structure created by the 73rd Amendment for rural areas. It's a very deliberate bottom-up hierarchy. Right at the foundational village level, you've got the Gram Panchayat. Take a step up to the block level and you find the Janpad, or Panchayat Samiti. And finally, at the highest local tier, the district level, sits the Zilla Parishad. Now, this system comes fully loaded with some genuinely progressive constitutional features. For example, there's a mandated reservation of 1/3 of the seats for women, plus proportional representation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. It's a fantastic way to empower marginalized groups. But here's the catch. When it comes to power transfer, the Constitution lists 29 subjects, things like agriculture, roads, drinking water, that are supposed to be handed over to these local bodies. However, the actual transfer is left entirely to the discretion of the state governments. And the reality? State leaders are incredibly hesitant to hand over real power because, well, they're terrified of losing their own relevance. This brings us to a fascinating detour in Section 3, the PESA Act exception. So the 1996 PESA Act was crafted specifically for areas with Adivasi, or tribal populations, to protect local traditions while bringing in democratic bodies. If you contrast a normal Gram Sabha with a PESA Gram Sabha, the difference is night and day. A normal Gram Sabha is relatively weak, its roles are strictly boxed in by the state. But a PESA Gram Sabha, it is incredibly powerful. Honestly, neither the center nor the state can make a move in these tribal areas without the Gram Sabha's direct approval. Want to mine, clear forest, or build a dam, you absolutely must have their mandatory consent first. All right, shifting our narrative arc back to the broader picture, let's look at Section 4, bureaucracy and funding shortfalls. What's really interesting here is the restrictive reality most local bodies actually face. Take this direct quote from our source material. Even for the simplest and the smallest schemes, you need to get the blessings of the IAS officers. Because state governments desperately want to maintain control, they just use the bureaucracy to do it. The local panchayat doesn't control the transfer or promotion of these admin officers, the state does. So what happens? The locally elected leaders basically end up as dummy bodies. They literally can't execute their own ideas without getting a nod from a state-controlled bureaucrat. And the money situation perfectly illustrates their helplessness. For both panchayats and municipalities, over 90% of their funds come strictly from central and state grants. Less than 10% comes from their own revenue sources. They have essentially zero financial independence. You're probably thinking, wait, why don't they just collect property taxes? Well, they could, but severe understaffing equals absolutely abysmal tax collection. These local bodies desperately lack the boots on the ground needed to actually go out, collect taxes, and execute complex plans. The truth is, very few administrative officers actually want to work at the panchayat or municipality level, and this chronic lack of staff ensures that local governments stay forever dependent on those state grants. Which leads us directly to the consequences in Section 5, Unchecked Corruption and Solutions. Okay, so despite having very little actual power, there is still a massive amount of grant money flowing down to the local level. And this creates what we can call the palatial bungalow reality. The source material shares a super vivid anecdote. You go to many villages, and you don't even have to ask who the panchayat president is. You just look for the massive, brand-new palatial bungalow. How does this happen? Well, high corruption thrives because of a glaring systemic flaw. There is a complete absence of audits by the CAG. That's the Comptroller and Auditor General, the nation's premier auditing agency. They audit the center, they audit the states, but they completely skip auditing the local bodies. Let's quickly summarize the roadblocks choking the system. States deliberately drag their feet on appointing state election commissions and state finance commissions. Because of this, local elections are rarely held on time. Then, you've got these massive bureaucratic chokeholds where IAS officers control the flow of everything. And on top of it all, zero financial auditing by the CAG, meaning funds can just vanish without a trace. So, how do we actually fix this? The source outlines some highly concrete solutions. For the problem of delayed local elections, which happen because state commissions are often politically loyal to the state, the proposed fix is the one nation, one election concept. This would mean the National Election Commission of India takes over and manages center, state, and local body elections all together. And for tackling that rampant local corruption, the fix is pretty straightforward. Mandate CAG audits for local bodies. You've got to bring basic financial accountability down to the grassroots. Which brings us to a final pressing question I want to leave you with. Are local bodies destined to remain mere agencies of corruption, constantly held back by reluctant states and zero accountability? Or could reforms like centralized election management and mandatory audits finally transform them into the true, vibrant engines of grassroots democracy they were always designed to be? It's a massive question for the future of governance. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next one.